The Eden 9 orbital station floated above Earth like a crown of glass and steel, its gardens suspended beneath a vast dome that shimmered with artificial sunlight. Vines curled along crystal archways, lanterns drifted weightlessly between trees, and the entire station seemed to hum with the sound of celebration. In the center aisle, Alara Monroe stepped forward. Her gown was spun from fabric embedded with microcrystals, catching starlight with every movement. Each step echoed with defiance, every heel strike a reminder of the path she had carved alone. Her grandmother's tears fell freely, hands clasped in joy. Friends leaned forward, some wiping their eyes, others simply stunned by the ethereal scene. Even the guests from the Ardent family, seasoned to power and wealth, whispered in awe, this was unforgettable. And yet 3 chairs remained empty. Front row, marked for Richard, Evelyn, and Orion Monroe. Empty, silent, condemned. Alara's chest rose as she met Cale's eyes at the altar. He wasn't looking at the spectacle or the galaxy glittering beyond the dome. He was looking at her like she was the only person who existed. When she reached him, he whispered so only she could hear. "They're not here, but everyone who matters is." Alara's lips curved into the faintest smile. For once, the absence didn't ache, it healed. The officiant spoke, but Alara barely heard. Her voice didn't shake as she said her vows, words of love, partnership, and a future that would never again be dictated by those who sought to erase her. When Cale slipped the ring onto her finger, the crowd erupted, the dome filled with applause that echoed like thunder in orbit. Dinner was served in the garden, beneath strings of light that glowed like constellations. Laughter rippled through the air, stories shared, toasts raised. Her aunt stood to speak, her voice trembling. "Alara, tonight you've proven something they never saw. That love isn't measured in grand facades or empty pride. It's measured in resilience, in choosing who deserves to stand beside you." The guests raised their glasses. Alara laughed, cheeks aching from joy, surrounded by people adjusting her gown, snapping photos, holding her close. And then she noticed it, dozens of holocams flashing. Guests posting, streaming, spreading the moment across every network in real time. Her smile deepened, because she knew exactly who would see it. Her parents, her brother, the ones who swore she would never belong, never succeed, never marry. And now they would watch, helpless, as the daughter they erased stood at the center of a universe that celebrated her without them. The Monroe family's silence was louder than any applause. Alara leaned into Cale as the first notes of their dance swelled through the garden. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was undeniable. The morning after the wedding, Alara's wristcom lit up like a siren. Dozens of missed calls, dozens more messages, all from the same 3 names, Richard, Evelyn, Orion. She didn't answer. Instead, she let their voices play out in the empty penthouse, each message uglier than the last. Her mother's words came first, drenched in hysteria. "How dare you exclude us, Alara? We are your parents. You've humiliated this family, humiliated me. A daughter should never shame her mother like this." Then her father's voice, steel-edged and venomous. "Do you realize what you've done? People at the country club are already talking. You married into power and left us out. You made fools of us." Finally, Orion, smug even in anger. "Enjoy it while it lasts, little sister. You think marrying Cale makes you someone? You'll always just be Alara, nothing more." Alara let the messages end, silence reclaiming the room. She didn't reply, she didn't need to. The public attack. By evening, her feeds exploded. Evelyn had flooded social holo with teary-eyed posts, painting herself as the victim. "My daughter abandoned me on the most important day of her life. A mother's heart is broken." Sympathy poured in. Strangers left comments about ungrateful children and the tragedy of modern families. Alara might have ignored it until Cale's father stepped in. The power move. That night, she was summoned to his private office. The man who controlled half the aerospace sector sat behind a desk of obsidian, his gaze sharp enough to pierce steel. "This ends now," he said flatly. "I will not have my family name dragged through their theater." He placed a single holo call, one line, one warning. No one outside that room ever heard the full conversation, but the result was immediate. By morning, every post was gone, every accusation deleted, every pity grab scrubbed from the net, and the Monroe family, silent. For the first time in years, silence wasn't Alara's cage. It was her weapon. She sipped her coffee by the window, watching the sunrise bleed over Chicago's skyline. Somewhere down there, her parents and Orion were choking on the same truth they'd forced down her throat her whole life. They had tried to erase her, but now she was the one erasing them. It came months later. By then, Alara's life had settled into a rhythm, strategy meetings at Ardent Aerospace, quiet nights with Cale, and the soft hum of peace she had never known under the Monroe roof. That peace shattered when her office assistant buzzed her wrist comm. "MS, Monroe, there's a man here. He says he won't leave until he sees you." Before she could answer, her office door swung open. Orion. But this wasn't the smug golden boy from the staircase. His suit was rumpled, his eyes shadowed, his swagger gone. He clutched a folder like it was a lifeline. "Alara, please, I need your help. I applied to Ardent. They'll hire me if you give a reference. You're my sister. You have to help me." Alara leaned back in her chair, studying him like a stranger. Her voice was calm, even gentle, which only made each word sharper. "Family helps family, right? Where was that when you locked me out of yours?" Orion flinched, his jaw tightening. "That was different. You can't still be holding a grudge." She cut him off with a look so cold it froze him mid-sentence. "Different. You stood there and told me I didn't belong. You laughed when they called me pathetic. You erased me, Orion. Now you want me to save you." His face reddened. Desperation cracked through the arrogance. I just need one chance." Alara stood, closing the distance until she was eye to eye with him. Her whisper landed like a knife between ribs. "So did I." She opened the door and stepped aside, her meaning clear. Security took him by the arm. He didn't fight. Couldn't. His silence was heavier than any insult he'd ever thrown at her. When the door shut behind him, Alara returned to her desk, heart steady. For the first time in their lives, Orion had left with nothing. She stared out the glass wall at the skyline, the city sprawling below her feet. The Monroe family had tried to break her, to bury her. Instead, they'd built the very fire that made her untouchable. And now, the reckoning was complete. The seasons turned. The Monroe name faded from headlines, their noise drowned out by the steady roar of Ardent Aerospace launching into new frontiers. Alara no longer cared. Her life had shifted into something richer, steadier. Nights spent sketching designs with Cale, mornings walking the gardens on Eden 9 when the station rotated into sunlight. For the first time, her world wasn't defined by exclusion. It was defined by choice. Then came the news that changed everything again. A pregnancy. Alara stood one morning before the floor-to-ceiling glass, hand resting on the small curve of her belly. Earth floated beneath her like a marble of blue and white. Her grandmother's voice had been the first she told. Evelyn had cried with joy, promising she'd live long enough to hold her great-grandchild. Weeks later, a package arrived at her door. Inside, a pair of hand-knitted baby booties. No note, just a photograph of her mother sitting in her old armchair, yarn in her lap, an olive branch or a performance. Days after, Alara saw the posts. Thrilled to become a grandmother again, Evelyn had written, claiming the joy publicly, rewriting history as if the past had never happened. Strangers showered her in sympathy and congratulations, never knowing the truth. Alara stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she closed it, gently, deliberately. She placed both hands over her stomach, speaking softly to the life growing within her. "Listen to me, little one. Blood makes you related, But love and respect, that's what makes you family. You'll never have to beg for a place at the table. You'll always belong." The words settled into the silence of the room, heavier than any vow she had ever spoken. Outside the glass, the earth turned, endless and unbothered. And for the first time, Ilara Monroe understood. The legacy she carried forward wasn't the one her parents tried to define. It was the one she chose. Ilara's heels clicked against the marble lobby of her downtown high-rise. The city lights spilled in through glass walls, but her reflection in the elevator doors told another story, jaw clenched, eyes burning, every word from her father echoing like a curse. "Pathetic, you don't belong, you'll never get married." The elevator chimed. The doors opened. And there he was, Cale Ardent. Tall, composed. The kind of man who carried quiet power like a second skin. His family name was etched across half the aerospace industry, his father's empire spanning continents and starports. To the world, Cale was a future titan. To Ilara, he was something rarer, the only person who had ever seen her as enough. He stepped forward, brushing a thumb across her cheek where her tears hadn't yet dried. "They did it again, didn't they?" Ilara swallowed hard, words trembling. "They said I didn't belong, that I'd never have a place in their world." Cale's gaze sharpened, steel beneath tenderness. "Then stop trying to belong in their world. We'll build our own." She managed a broken laugh. "Funny, they told me I'd never get married." Cale smiled slowly, slipping his hand into his jacket pocket. When it re-emerged, the city lights caught the gleam of a ring. Not just any ring, sleek platinum, inlaid with starlight diamonds mined from Titan's surface. He held it out with unwavering certainty. "Then let's prove them wrong. Ilara Monroe, will you marry me?" Her breath caught. She'd been wearing a simple band for months in secret, hidden from her family's dismissive eyes. But now, with his words, it wasn't just a proposal, it was a declaration. She slid the ring onto her finger, hand steady this time. Her voice was soft but brimming with fire. "Yes, and they'll choke on every word they said about me." Cale leaned closer, whispering. "Then it's settled. We don't invite them. Not now, not ever." Outside, the city roared with life, oblivious to the war quietly being declared inside that penthouse. Ilara Monroe wasn't broken. She was armed. And for the first time, she held the upper hand. The Ardent name moved faster than gossip. Within weeks, whispers spread. Ilara Monroe was engaged to Cale Ardent, heir to the aerospace empire. The same Ilara they'd dismissed, mocked, erased. Suddenly, she wasn't pathetic anymore. She was power. The first call came from her mother. "Ilara, sweetheart, your grandmother told us. You're really getting married. We should be there. We deserve to be there. We're your parents." Ilara's voice was cool, every syllable measured like a scalpel. "Deserve? When you cut me out of Orion's wedding, when you lied and told the world I was too sick to attend, you made it clear then where I stood." Her mother's breath caught, panic edging her tone. "That was a mistake, families fight, but we can't be excluded from this." Ilara didn't flinch. "You excluded me first. Don't beg for a door you slammed shut." The next call came from her father. His voice, once booming with authority, now carried strain. "Listen, Ilara, people will talk if we're not there. It'll make us look bad." She almost laughed. "Oh, I understand. You don't care about me. You care about appearances." He snapped, mask slipping. "You'll regret this, do you hear me? You'll regret humiliating your own family." Ilara's tone dropped, low and lethal. "I don't regret choosing peace over poison." And then Orion himself showed up. He sauntered into her office lobby, smug as ever, cufflinks gleaming, voice dipped in false charm. "Come on, Ilara. You can't seriously keep me out. I'm your brother, the golden boy, remember? Imagine the photos, our family looking perfect again." Ilara rose from her chair slowly, eyes locked on him like a predator. "Perfect? You mean when you smirked while they called me pathetic? When you told me I didn't belong? That's the family you want to display?" Orion's grin faltered. She leaned in, her words slicing through his arrogance. "You had your wedding without me. Now I'll have mine without you. Fair trade." For the first time in his life, Orion had no comeback. Alara turned her back on him, walking away as her security detail guided him out. He had come expecting her to fold. Instead, he left with the truth. The Monroe family was no longer the center of Alara's orbit. News traveled fast, faster than light in the digital age. Within a week, the Monroe family name was buzzing in social feeds, not because of Orion's perfect wedding, but because Alara Monroe was engaged to Cale Ardent, heir to the largest aerospace empire in North America. The same Alara they had erased. Suddenly, their phones couldn't stay silent. The mother's plea. The first call came at midnight. Evelyn's voice was sugar-laced with panic. "Alara, darling, we heard. Is it true? Are you getting married to Cale Ardent? Oh, sweetheart, of course your father and I should be there. We're your parents. We deserve to be there." Alara's tone was sharp as a blade. "Deserve? You told the world I was too sick to attend Orion's wedding. You erased me. Why would you think you have a place at mine?" Her mother's breath hitched, then softened into begging. "That was a mistake. Families fight, Alara, but we don't cut each other out forever." Alara's laugh was cold, hollow. "Funny, that's exactly what you did." The father's ultimatum. The next call was Richard, his voice tight with restrained fury. "Listen, Alara, it'll look bad if we're not there. People will talk. Do you want your own family to look like outcasts?" Alara didn't hesitate. "You didn't care about my reputation when you called me pathetic. Don't pretend you care now. You only care about appearances." Richard snapped, mask cracking. "You'll regret humiliating us like this." Alara's reply cut through him like steel. "No, the only thing I regret is ever thinking you'd be proud of me." The brothers smirk. Finally, Orion himself showed up. He strolled into Alara's office lobby as if he owned it, his grin polished, voice dripping with arrogance. "Come on, Alara, be reasonable. I'm your brother. The golden boy, remember. Don't ruin the family name. Let me stand by your side and everything will look perfect again." Alara rose from behind her desk slowly, her heels echoing against marble. She stepped close enough for him to feel her anger radiating. "Perfect, like when you smirked while they called me worthless. Perfect, like erasing me from your wedding." His smirk faltered. Her voice dropped, deadly calm. "You had your day without me, Orion. Now I'll have mine without you. Consider us even." Security escorted him out, his protests fading into the hall. For the first time, Alara saw it, fear flickering in his eyes. Alara closed her office door, her heart steady. The Monroe family thought she'd crawl back, thought she needed their approval. But the truth was clear now, they needed her, and she would never let them forget it. The stars had never looked closer. Chicago, 2075. The city blazed with neon holograms, towers of glass piercing the night sky while self-driving cars streaked down the interstate like streams of fire. Inside a sleek black autopod, Alara Monroe leaned back in the rear seat. Another brutal day at the Aerospace AI Corporation was behind her, but her eyes were still locked on a floating screen of project data hovering in the air. Then, her wrist comm vibrated sharply. The caller ID lit up, Grandma Evelyn. Alara allowed herself a tired smile. Her grandmother's calls were rare but always carried warmth. She answered quickly. "Hey, Grandma, I missed you." But the voice that came through wasn't warm, it was trembling. "Alara, sweetheart, how are you feeling? Are you getting any better?" Alara frowned, sitting upright. "Better, Grandma, I'm fine. Why would you ask that?" A long pause, heavy, the kind of silence that tells you the next words will split your world in half. Finally, her grandmother's voice broke, fragile but steady enough to wound. "Your parents told everyone you've been very ill. That's why you couldn't make it to Orion's wedding last weekend." The words slammed into Alara like a car crash. Her chest seized. Her grip tightened against the seat until her knuckles turned white. "What wedding?" she whispered, voice cracking. The pod kept gliding down the highway, lights flashing by, but to Alara it was all gone, blurred into nothing. Her brother had gotten married. The family had gathered. They dressed in silk and crystal, toasted under chandeliers, and she had been erased. Not forgotten, erased. And in that moment, Alara knew this wasn't just a phone call. It was a declaration of war. Alara's fingers trembled as she swiped her wristcom, pulling up the public holonet. A command, a flash, and suddenly the cabin of her autopod filled with glowing projections. And there it was, her brother's wedding. Orion stood beneath an arch of white roses spun from light, his silver tux gleaming under crystalline chandeliers. Their father, her father, beamed as he walked Orion down the aisle like it was his own coronation. Their mother, Evelyn, sat in the front row, tears streaming as though she were watching history itself unfold. The images shifted, guests raising crystal glasses, laughter echoing in surround sound. Every cousin, every family friend, neighbors she hadn't seen in years. Even her mother's book club sat grinning at velvet-covered tables. And her? Nowhere. Alara's stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat as she swiped through feed after feed. Her brother dancing with his new bride, their parents basking in applause, toasts, smiles, kisses. It wasn't a small, private ceremony. This was a spectacle. 100 guests at least, maybe more. They had gone out of their way to invite everyone they'd ever known. Everyone except her. Alara's jaw locked. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate, calculated, a clean erasure of her existence. The glow of holograms lit her face as she whispered to the empty pod, voice breaking but venom sharp. "You didn't forget me. You erased me." And just like that, grief curdled into fury. The tires screeched as Alara's autopod swerved into her parents' circular driveway. The night air was sharp, but her fury burned hotter. She didn't knock, didn't hesitate. She slammed the front door open so hard it rattled against the wall. "Alara!" Her mother's voice floated in from the kitchen, cheerful at first. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on a silk towel. The smile on her lips froze when she saw her daughter's eyes. Alara's voice was ice. "Why wasn't I invited to Orion's wedding?" The color drained from Evelyn's face. She fumbled for words, her composure slipping. We thought you wouldn't want a big crowd. You never liked those kinds of events." Alara laughed, a short, bitter sound that cut the air like glass. "You decided that for me. You erased me because it was easier." Heavy footsteps echoed from the living room. Richard, her father, appeared with a glass of brandy in his hand, brows furrowed in annoyance. "What's with all the yelling?" Alara turned on him, fire in her eyes. "Tell me why I was cut out of my own brother's wedding." Richard's jaw tightened. He set his glass down slowly, like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "You really want the truth?" Her voice shook, but it didn't waver. "Yes." His words were blunt, cruel, final. "Because Orion has his life together. He's successful. He married someone who matches him. If you had shown up, you would have looked pathetic." The word hit harder than a slap. Alara's breath caught in her throat, but before she could respond, another voice sliced down the staircase. Orion, descending casually, cufflinks glinting, smirk already in place. "Honestly, Alara, he's right. It would have been awkward. Everyone knows you don't belong in that world." Silence stretched. The air felt suffocating. Then Alara straightened, eyes cold, voice low but steady. "Then don't expect an invitation to mine." Her father chuckled, cruel and dismissive. "Be serious. You'll never get married." Their laughter followed her as she turned, shoulders rigid, walking out into the night. And with every step, she swore they'd regret underestimating her.